Are men's problems mainly personal and self-created, while women's problems are caused by men and male-dominated culture? And is it worse to be propositioned at a mathematics conference than to be told by your entire culture that your sexuality is sick and violent? And how did we get to the point where the relatively trivial problems of one sex can entirely obliterate the problems of another? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo file. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. This is the last video of our second season. Steve and I are going to be taking a short break and will resume later in the summer. A while back, one of my Facebook friends alerted me to a December 2014 blog post by an MIT computer science professor named Scott Aaronson. It described the loneliness, confusion, and self-hatred Aaronson had experienced as a self-described young math nerd, and the bitterness of being told by a feminist culture over and over again about his privilege as a man. The post is a must-read for anybody who cares about the male half of society and the lack of fit between feminist theory and so many men's lives. Among other things, Aaronson explains his experience of his sexuality was a source of unceasing humiliation and torment. Quote, he says, "I spent my formative years, basically from the age of 12 until my mid-20s, feeling not entitled, not privileged, but terrified. I was terrified that one of my female classmates would somehow find out that I sexually desired her, and that the instant she did, I would be scorned, laughed at, called a creep and a weirdo, maybe even expelled from school or sent to prison. And furthermore, that the people who did these things to me would somehow be morally right to do them, even if I couldn't understand how." He goes on, "You can call that my personal psychological problem if you want, but it was strongly reinforced by everything I picked up from my environment. To take one example, the sexual assault prevention workshops we had to attend regularly as undergrads, with their endless lists of all the forms of human interaction that might be sexual harassment or assault, and their refusal ever to specify anything that definitely wouldn't be sexual harassment or assault. I left each of those workshops with enough fresh paranoia and self-hatred to last me through another year." End quote. The whole post is insightful and funny and sad, not only describing Aaronson's pain in feeling ugly and unwanted, but also the depressing conviction that he deserved to be unwanted. And nobody cared about his experience. There were no professors researching it or activists protesting it, no panels convened to discuss it, no government committees reporting on measures to alleviate it, no task forces to prevent further suffering, no poster campaigns to alert the public, no government money spent on helping victims. He was alone. He described in compelling detail how, as a young man, he begged a doctor to give him some kind of medication to have his sexual drive eliminated, how he thought often about suicide, and how the only thing that saved him was his love of mathematics. Eventually, success in mathematics enabled him to gain the confidence to be different in the world, to meet women, and eventually to marry and have a child, which transformed his life. But in the course of his struggle, it was understandably difficult for him to keep believing in feminist claims about the system of male power and female powerlessness. He tells us this, quote, "Now, the whole time I was struggling with this, I was also fighting a second battle to maintain the liberal, enlightened feminist ideals that I had held since childhood against a powerful current pulling me away from them. I reminded myself every day that there's no conspiracy to make the world a hell for shy male nerds. There are only individual women and men trying to play the cards they're dealt, and the confluence of their interests sometimes leads to crappy outcomes. No woman owes male nerds anything. No woman deserves blame if she prefers the Neanderthals. Everyone's free choice demands respect." End quote. In the end, according to Aronson, he did manage to maintain his feminist ideals. He states now his commitment to encouraging girls to go into science, his support for affirmative action hiring, and his horror at the supposedly typical and widespread female experience of sexual assault and harassment. But Aronson continues to bristle at the generally accepted idea of male privilege. It simply isn't so, he argued in the Post. Men, too, can be victims of sexism, and the vast majority of ordinary, non-alpha men are not privileged at all. Well, not surprisingly, his post stirred up a hornet's nest of opposition and angry denunciation. Feminists objected not only that a man would put his pain in words in order to contradict the theory of male privilege, how dare he, but also that he would seem to put at least part of the blame on feminism itself, the sacred not-to-be-contradicted equality movement, for some of the difficulties he had experienced. The general opinion was, well, maybe he'd been miserable, but he had only himself to blame. He couldn't legitimately blame a larger society in the way women always can. So what if he had to attend some sexual assault prevention programs? Well, women have to get raped. I have to admit I didn't read most of the feminist attacks on Aronson. I just couldn't bear it. But I did read Arthur Chu's nominally sympathetic piece in Salon magazine called The Plight of the Bitter Nerd, in which a self-proclaimed fellow nerd comes forward to teach Scott Aronson all about women's suffering that he hadn't apparently understood. According to Chu, although Scott's suffering was real, it was a self-imposed suffering, almost entirely caused by ideas inside his own head, while women's suffering, on the other hand, is not only real, but also externally imposed, as we see demonstrated in the claims of a woman named Amy who responded to Scott's blog, telling him how she'd been sexually harassed and ultimately assaulted by shy nerds. So there, shy nerds couldn't be let off the hook. The Salon writer's main point in the article is that men had better get used to the fact that there is a qualitative difference between their pain and that of women. He sums it up as follows, quote, Scott's story is about things that happened inside his brain. Amy's story is about actual things that were done to her by other people against her will, without her control, end quote. Well, that's a rhetorically neat opposition, even if it is obviously wrong. It leaves out the fact that men are harassed and sexually assaulted too, that men are the victims of violence far more often than women are, that men's depression is real enough to cause disproportionately higher incidence of male suicide, and that feminist culture telling Scott he's dirty and disgusting is palpably real, not something he made up in his head. But none of that matters to Mr. Chu, whose feminist blinkers were firmly in place. It's not at all surprising that Aronson's lament would fall on the deaf ears of ideologues who refuse to acknowledge the male victims of our gynocentric culture. But some non-ideologues did hear Aronson's story and were moved by it. And perhaps more importantly, other men read his post and were comforted and could believe that they might live through their personal hells and come out the other side. Stories like Scott's have had a huge impact on me too. When I gave my first public lecture at the University of Toronto 3 years ago, I had a pretty good idea about the, in my opinion, belligerent SJW opposition that would cry foul. And true to form, they staged a protest of hysterical dimensions and pulled the fire alarm to try to prevent my evil words from polluting the minds of the young.
Academic feminism, as it is practiced and disseminated in our universities, is overwhelmingly intellectually empty, incoherent, and dishonest. Its whole reason for being depends on an activist orientation towards women's position in society.
But at that time, I had little idea who I was speaking for, the young men and the not so young men who had come to recognize that their society cared a lot more about women than it did about them. In the months that followed the talk, I received a lot of emails from these men telling me about their lives, especially their sense of being blamed for everything and the concrete injustices they had experienced. Here are just a few examples. The first is from an email from a man who wrote me after my talk at Queen's University in 2014 about being a male student. This is what he says, quote, I was born in 1988, and my experience at school was that at every level of education there was outreach for girls and both explicit and implicit understandings that girls were to be treated with respect and sensitivity. This doctrine was never extended to the boys. The impression that this gave me, and all boys I'm sure, was that girls were the victims of some form of bias or prejudice that we, the boys, were not to encourage or repeat. I think it is all but impossible for a child to realize the way he internalizes that message and assumes that his own problems and inadequacies are his own fault and unimportant, especially since we were never aware what misdeed against girls we were supposed to ameliorate. The grievances of past generations never answered the question of why we were to give our female peers more respect than we were allowed to give ourselves, end quote. And he goes on to describe what he calls the, quote, toxic and shame-inducing experience of having female teachers make it clear that they preferred female students to male students and that they had contempt for the male part of humanity. Here's a story from somebody at the other end of the life spectrum looking back on divorce and losing contact with his son. Quote, he tells us, 45 years ago, I had to sit in a police counselor's office while she and my ex-wife told me that my son was being taken out of the state, where I could never see him without great difficulty and hardship, against my wishes, and that there was nothing I could do about it. I've seen him twice since then. He didn't look good either time. Now I don't know where he is, how he is, or even if he's still alive. Every day I burn with a furious passion about the injustice that's been done to my son, to me, and to millions of men and their children under the oppression of feminism. Because I know how I feel, I know how those other men feel. Just under the surface in every one of them burns that same furious passion, and it's past the point of negotiating away or counseling away, end quote. A third example involves someone I came to know in Ottawa who returned home from a trip abroad to discover that his wife had thrown a bunch of his clothes and belongings into his car, telling him she was divorcing him. When he tried to enter their home, she called the police, saying she feared for her life because her husband was a controlling man and a gun enthusiast. In fact, he was a collector of heirloom, non-functional firearms. But following the feminist script, the police informed my friend that he had to stay away from his wife and their children, that if he went into his own home, he would be charged with trespassing. Through the long divorce proceedings, which led my friend deeply into debt and caused such stress that he lost his job, his ex-wife told lies about her fear of him and deliberately alienated his children, whom he has now not seen for over 10 years. Nearly $500,000 in debt and unable to work due to physical and emotional disabilities, my friend is convinced that his life will never recover. But his story, as I've learned, is absolutely ordinary. Over the years, I realized that these stories weren't just for me, that they deserved to be read by a wider public. And so I got the idea for a book. I decided to call the book Sons of Feminism in order to emphasize the centrality of the feminist revolution in changing the lives of men today in negative ways. If you have a story you want to tell, please consider contributing a 3,000 to 5,000 word personal essay to this book. I want readers to understand what it means to grow up male in a post-feminist world that actively denies the reality or significance of male suffering. Details about the book will be posted on the Studio Brulé site. Male pain isn't only about things guys make up in their heads, as the Salon magazine article outrageously declared. Male pain is real, and it's totally unacceptable.